So I've been sitting on these figures since around December, but now Dune Part 2 is finally about to release in cinemas. I'm seeing it next week and I'm really excited for that movie. While I was visiting California, I went around to many different Targets and I found the McFarlane DUNE Part 2 toys available. And at that time, also on a sale of only 20 USD each. These are now finally being sold in NZ. I think they started coming around here around January-ish. McFarlane toys are actually being sold at our regular retailers, which has never happened before. And we have these all priced at around 50 NZD each. That's around 30 USD converted. So I got these on a really good deal actually. I have all 4 of the single release figures. We have here Feyd-Rautha and Emperor Shaddam IV, and these guys represent our villain figures, and then we have Paul Atreides and Chani for our Fremen figures. Standard McFarlane toy box design, we've got the figures in a nice window display at the front, and we've got some artwork that does fit the style of the movie, and on the back, the toys feature a short description of each of those characters. Chani and Paul seem to have the exact same box art as one another, but the Emperor and Feyd-Rautha do have a unique box art design for them, which I think is interesting to see. I had the entire first wave of McFarlane Dune figures from that first movie, so my investment with that wave already meant that I was going to try and find these figures any way that I possibly could, and I just so happened to be at the right place at the right time. Out of the box here, these are your figures and their inclusions. We have a few different weapons in the blades area and some display stands. Some of the stands are your simple McFarlane black bases, but some of them are actually themed to Dune. They're sand displays, which is really cool to see. Paul is the only repeat figure from the single releases. I could have skipped him since again I do have that original release figure, but the key differences here are those blue eyes, some sand stained textures in the still suit, and the wired soft goods. These details I think are key in defining him compared to the original release, which is what really sold me on this figure overall. A better look at some of those real distinct differences that I was mentioning earlier. I think the face likeness is much better this time around, and I was already pretty satisfied with that likeness. The sand details on the still suit also look really good and dynamic compared to that original release. The cloth goods are really interesting actually. We have 2 separate parts here that represent a cape and a cloak. The hood piece on the back can actually interact with the figure, which is always nice to see. You know, sometimes the hoods can't function like that on every action figure, so I am happy to see it react like this. The cuts made on the cloaks here though feel a little off to me. The armholes seem very different in their sizes around the edges, and it's also really torn on some sides but smooth on others. You can view this as one of 2 different ways. It's either an intentional design to make it feel more makeshift, which is a really cool attention to detail, or that it feels a little cheap, like some corners were cut, and that's a little disappointing. I can kinda go either way personally. All of the soft goods on these figures have bendy wires in the seams, which means that you can pose them any way you want, and I love that inclusion. These figures all feel more detailed than your average standard Hasbro figure, and they have a pretty similar retail price here in NZ as well. I love posing the robes, and I think that these really take the figures even further than the first wave. Paul's articulation is pretty good for him. We've got some movements in the head like bends and rotates available to us. He has some very slight clavicle movements in the arms, otherwise he can just bend and rotate here. Rotate in the upper arm here and double bends in the elbows. He also has rotates and bends in the wrist, and the same articulation can be found on the other arm entirely. For his torso, we've got some bends and some rotates in the ribs, and a little bit of movement here in the hips as well. His legs can move outward here with some minor movements, and some bends in the knee. It's a double bend joint, feet with some rotates, and even some toe bends here too, which is really surprising to see. For Paul's accessories, he includes this really big long sword, which is a little warped on my end, so I'm gonna need to buff that out or something, and the sand-based display stand, which is the exact same one that Chani includes, but it's a nice change compared to the plain black one. Like the McFarlane DC action figures, we also have these collector cards, which features character artwork and a small description on the back of the figure, and I don't really care much for these inclusions honestly, so I'm going to mention them here so that we can move on from this. Now Chani was really high on my wish list, and she's our first new addition to this collection. These figures all feature pretty much the same body sculpt as one another, so there's not too much to say that's too different about them besides a couple of key details. Chani here has different soft goods compared to Paul. I do like the style that she's got of a coat thing rather than a cape. Chani also has a soft goods hood, but this one actually doesn't function the same way as Paul's, like I was mentioning before. Her hair does get in the way here, and the cut itself is just a little off. I'm a big fan of that likeness to Zendaya. She's had a few action figures made of herself now over the past few years, and this is a good standout one. Like Paul, she also has bendy wires in her soft goods, so you can pose her as though her clothes are reacting to the winds. They look really good together actually. The soft goods here really sell it for me. For her articulation, it's actually the same as Paul's. We've got some head movements here. Her arm can bend and rotate in all the same places as Paul. We have some movements in her torso, and the legs can both move outwards and inwards, and they can rotate. We also have some double bends in the knee, and I think the body molds are really the exact same, so it's good to see that they can move the exact same ways as one another. Chani features one unique accessory, and that is this crysknife. I really love how each of these Dune figures have their own specially molded accessories that are all seemingly unique to each figure. The knife sits in her hand pretty well, and to top it off she comes with the same sand base plate that Paul comes with. I was hoping that there would be a little bit of variation to these and maybe a connection peg to be made or something. They can't really connect together, but again, I do prefer this stylized design rather than the plain black one like the villain villains have. This is Feyd-Rautha, finally some antagonists for our wave. The first wave only featured Rabban as a buildable figure and a giant statuette of the Baron, so it is nice to get some proper action figures of the villains here. That Harkonnen black armor is really cool to see here on this toy, and I think that the figure overall is a really good one to have in that collection. His cape is really cool from afar, but up close I'm a little disappointed in the quality of the connections there. One side looks really solid, but the other side appears to have come apart over the past couple of days of having this guy, and I don't know if maybe I did that when I opened the figure, or if I happened to grab a bad figure from the batch or something, but you've probably seen so far up until this point that the soft goods have been a bit inconsistent. One of the better bendy wire pieces though, a long cape, which is really fun to mess around with here. His articulation is nice and simple, seeing as how he's practically a plain action figure. We've got some pretty good head movements here, and for his arms we can move them upwards and outwards and rotate them here as well. He also has some clavicle movements and some crunchy double bends in the elbows. Hand movements are also made available to us. He's got some upper torso rotates and can rotate at the waist as well. Legs feature the usual movements outwards and upwards, and some rotates here too. Double bends in the knee, and some feet movements and some toe movements. Two accessories for him here, a smaller white blade and a longer black blade. Two more unique sword accessories just made for him. They look pretty cool. I really like that minimalist approach that they've gone for here, and the final inclusion is your standard McFarlane display stand. The Emperor is the last single release figure here, and he features the likeness of Christopher Walken, which feels like exciting casting. His most notable feature that's exclusive to him compared to the other figures is this big soft gown that he wears, which features the bendy wires in the sleeves. I think that this whole thing looks really great overall. The sleeves have an elastic band that wrap around the hand so that the robe can be kept in place here. You're probably wondering what he looks like underneath that robe, so I'll just go ahead and remove it for you now and show off how simple he is underneath. He's just a plain McFarlane body mold, which I have to assume is what they all look like underneath their special armor pieces. His texture is slightly different to the other figures here. It's really cool actually to see something weird and unique like this. He features no details underneath besides some sculpting definition. His articulation is very easy to cover while he's dressed like this. We have some head rotates here and the same arm movements that we've covered already. Some clavicle movements, a bit more obvious here, bends and rotates in the joints too. We have double bends in the elbows, and the hands have their own movements as well. The same thing can be said for the other side entirely, which moves the exact same way. Rotates appear in the torso in two different places here, both in the upper torso and the middle section, which also allows movements for the lower torso, which is just above the hips there. For the legs, we have some movements for upwards and outwards, double bends in the knee, and then some rotates in the feet and some toe bends as well. Here's a plain figure, so everything functions the way that it should. With his robe back on, he still functions the same way, but there's a little bit of restraint on the joints now that there's a fabric material hindering those movements, but because he is such an older character, he probably doesn't need to be doing too much movement anyway. Accessories, he's very plain. He doesn't come with anything besides the display stand. I really love the Dune figures overall. I think that McFarlane Toys makes for some pretty cool stuff, considering that their prices tend to match Hasbro Legends nowadays. It wasn't always the case. That's only been a recent thing that Hasbro's decided to increase those prices on Black Series and Legends figures. I think it's easy to see the comparative value between the two companies here. The figures feature more movements, and the IPs are usually targeted more towards the adult audience, and the fact that NZ retailers are finally starting to stock this company's toys, it's a dream come true for the younger me.